I always have a special one for you. This is a good friend of mine, Raphael Andrade. I'm going to call you out as a leadership expert, a mentor, an entrepreneur, just an all-around badass. He's not going to say he's a badass, but when we get into his history, you'll see this guy does not get rattled very easily.
Well, thank you for having me, Joe. I appreciate it. And it's good to be here, especially because it's an honor for me because I follow you, follow your podcast. I've had a number of your friends in my podcast, and these are people that do amazing things, and so thank you for having me here.
Thanks for coming. So you had a pretty easy life. I've done 700 podcasts. Most people have had challenging upbringings, but you are an anomaly. You just had it super easy growing up.
At least from my perspective, it's I've had it very easy. I mean, I grew up in Panama. I was born and raised in Panama in the 70s. My mom and dad, were good people, well off. My father is a doctor. My mom was a lawyer, middle class, no problems, didn't suffer from bullying or anything like that. But it seemed to me that, at least from the people that I talk to, people who know me, that depending on your perspective, what I consider easy maybe is not easy for somebody else. And what I consider hard maybe is not hard for somebody else. So for me, coming to this country the way that I did, I wanted to do everything legally. I was running away from dictatorship back in the 80s with Noriega, right? We had an invasion of our country back then. And when things like that happen, you, as a teenager, you see things that teenagers shouldn't have to see, right? And you experience things that people shouldn't have to experience. Nothing like what's happening in other countries these days, but it was still kind of a defining moment. And at the time, I didn't think it was something that could break me, but it certainly gave me some perspective on what matters at a very young age.
When did you get to the United States? How old were you?
I came here a couple of different times. I came in 87, so I was 16. I was trying, again, my mom had decided that it wasn't safe for me to stay in Panama. So I went to California, I went to Puerto Rico, I ended up in New York, in Queens. And
that's why we get along.
Yeah, I know. I ended up high school in New York City, in San Francisco Prep in Fresh Meadows. That was a tough time because even though I was staying with family, we didn't have internet back then. And sometimes you call home and you couldn't get a hold of your family, and then you see the news and there's rioting and all these kinds of things. So it was a tough time. Then I went back after graduation, thinking things were going to get better, and that's when things got really bad, and then the invasion happened, right? And then we had a state of curfew and martial law for a few months before things stabilized. And during that time, things got a little bit complicated. But again, at the time, I didn't see it as something that would be overwhelming. But when I talk to people about it and I go through the details of some of the things that happened, they're like, well, no, that's actually pretty hard.
Well, it's funny, right? Because it's not what happens to us. Something's going to happen to all of us. A lot of something's going to happen to all of us. We're going to face obstacles, but it's how we react to it. So for whatever reason, you had the ability to deal with obstacles better than most. And that's the big takeaway, I think, on this podcast and our, what we do as a brand is you couldn't control Noriega and those things that were happening, but you can control how you respond.
Yeah, and I think a lot of credit goes to my parents. Both of my parents were from very big families, from extremely humble beginnings. My mom was one of 12. My dad was one of 7. Is one of 7. And they were both at the younger end of those families. My dad was the only one in his family who went to college. My mom was the only one in her family to finish multiple degrees in college. But they always reminded me of those humble beginnings where it was really, really tough, where everybody was sleeping in one room type of thing. Growing up, I was always reminded, look, you're good, but it's not this good for everybody. So always keep that in mind. So when I came to this country the second time to go to college, I ended up running out of money before I needed to graduate. So I started working and I didn't have money for rent. So I was homeless for about 3 months, sleeping in a church. And again, at the time, I'm not going to say that it was easy, but it didn't seem overwhelming. But it gives you a definition of resilience which is something that you and I talk about a lot. And you talk about it in your podcast. I talk about it in mine. It comes in different flavors. The life throws you all these curveballs, and you can either back out every time or stay in the box and see if you can actually hit it.
Yeah, what's interesting is you probably had that mindset because there was some shakiness under your feet from an early age. You and I were talking about this new puppy I got, and the new puppy, which is descendant of a wolf, right? And a wolf or a coyote could deal with anything. And this little puppy that's been in my house for, let's say, 3 weeks is getting cuddled and coddled and carried, and tried to bring her out for a walk just now in the rain. She doesn't want to get her paws wet. She's probably not able to deal with adversity, right? So for whatever reason, you were introduced to something at a young age that made you a little more, gave you a little more heart and an ability to deal with it than most.
Yeah, and I think that is also, in addition to what we just discussed, it was also that desire of wanting something more. Since I was a little kid, I was very focused on learning the English language as, properly. And I always had these dreams of coming to the United States for a variety of reasons. So we have a saying that comes from the colonial times when the Spaniards came to Latin America of, you got to burn the boat. And I knew that when I first came here, second time I came, when I went to college, that I'm going to do everything here legally. I was never here illegal. I wanted to do it the proper way. I knew that was going to be really hard, but I burned the boat. I'm not going back, and I'm going to have to do what I have to do. From cleaning restaurants at 2 a.m. and then delivering newspapers, and then doing engineering school. It was, again, I was just doing it because I was looking forward. I wasn't looking backwards at all, because I knew that although I love my country, my future wasn't there, because I needed to be here for whatever reason I believe I needed to be here.
Somebody said to me years ago, a woman showed up on my farm. This is a crazy story. And I said, could I help you? She said, I just climbed the 7 summits. And for whatever reason, I found your podcast and I listened to it over and over, all your podcasts during this climb. And so when I came back, when she finished, she wanted to come meet me. And she just showed up at the door. And she said something. She said, we learn helplessness. The puppy is learning help. Most of us, we're protected. We got Uber Eats. We're learning helplessness. So deep down inside, somewhere, everybody's got the trait to be able to fight through it, right?
Giving up, independent of what degree you choose to look at that whole spectrum of giving up, it's a learned thing, because we are born resilient beings. From a neurological point of view or neuroscientific point of view, which is something that I'm certainly not an expert on, but I'm a student of. We are born ready to learn whatever is thrown at us. If you take a child and the more you expose that child to, the more resilient that child becomes. And the more you shelter that child, the less resilient that child becomes. Now, that doesn't, that's not 100% accurate all the time, because nothing in life is, 0 or 100. Because I was in many ways sheltered as a child. I mean, my parents worked their butts off to have a career so that me and my sisters didn't go through the things they went through. But maybe it was something in their resilience that, came down to me and my sisters. Both of them are also, very successful, and they've also learned the never quitting, never giving up. My youngest sister just, survived cancer, right? And she keeps going, right? So I think, yes, a lot of these things are taught one way or the other. But my point is if we are taught helplessness, we have the ability to unteach that to ourselves.
No, I agree. That person that feels helpless and can't do anything, as soon as they move to a new country like you did, that changes everything. Right? You're on the offense now. You're not like everybody in that. When we moved to Japan, we lived in Japan for a little while, like that leveled up the game. Everybody speaking another language, like better than anybody.
Yeah. I spent some time in Japan too, and that there is something to be said talking about helplessness when you're in a place where you cannot read, you cannot write, you cannot understand anything. None of the characters make any sense. And you're like, what am I going to do? Well, I I'm going to study and I'm going to figure it out because I'm not going to be helpless, period.
What could people do that are out there in your opinion, what could they do to level up, to maybe wash away some of that helplessness?
I think it's a matter of self-observation, right? More recently, I've gone through some tough times in my life. I went through a unfortunate divorce. Fortunately, my kids are grown and they're doing well, all three of them. But I've lost everything, and I've had to reinvent myself all over. And I think the reason why I was able to do that at this late in my career is because of how I have learned and I've been taught through some of my mentors to observe what's happening. What I mean by that is we're not responsible for where we were born and how our parents raised us, right? And the fact that our country had a dictatorship, back in the day, right? None of those things were of our making. But everything I choose to do now is of my choice, right? And if I want to be better tomorrow, there are things I have to do today in order to be better tomorrow, just like working out. You go to the gym once, you go back home, you look in the mirror, what do you see? Nothing. It is the consistency. So for me, I am very consistent in how I observe everything that gets thrown at me, because life is going to throw things at me. In baseball analogy, it's going to be fastballs, screwballs, curveballs, changeups. And I have to be prepared to observe the pitch and to observe what's being thrown and observe how I react to it and observe how I process it. And for me, it's very important. And some people may disagree with this, but it works for me. I know that my thoughts are not mine, my feelings are not mine, my emotions are not mine. I'm just the vessel that processes all of that. And that helps me understand when somebody's yelling at me or somebody's being unfair at me or somebody is stabbing me in the back, a former business partner. That's all happening over there. I choose how to process that. I choose whether I'm going to get offended by that. I choose whether I'm going to get, depressed by that. And I have a rule. I have my friends, people who are close to me, they make fun of me because I have this 5-minute rule. Something bad happens, I'm going to get upset and really pissed off for about 5 minutes. And I put my timer and I allow myself to lose it for 5 minutes and then I'm done. Then I got to move on. Then I got to see, okay, how do I recover? How do I make it? How do I fix it? How do I make everything better? How do I make this moment a learning lesson? And for me, I've been practicing that probably for the past 10 years, and it made a huge difference.
I like that. The 5-minute rule. If everybody could apply that to their lives, then
you're not hanging on to anything, right? I question everything. I question all my thoughts. Why am I thinking this? Is this useful? And we talked about this when I had you on the podcast about this whole thing of your bag of tools, right? Going from Sri Lanka to Everest and then trying to climb Everest with the same tools you left Sri Lanka with.
Right.
We have to continuously question our toolkit. Just because I did something or I had a particular set of habits that worked in the past doesn't mean they're going to work now, right? Just because I was able to. So the case in point, in 2006, I broke my leg pretty badly. And they had it was 3 surgeries to get it fixed. Now I have, piece of metal, 5 screws permanently there. At the time, 2006, it was the peak of the opioid thing when it was just getting started. So I had a pretty bad reaction to the stuff that they gave me, which is like the OxyContin, right? I couldn't handle it. I started having hallucinations and I just got up and the rest of them, I flushed them down the toilet. Well, I was 14 weeks on crutches, right? I was without any load bearing before even PT started. I'm getting ready for shoulder surgery now, right? I need to now evaluate, well, that worked for me back then. Is it going to work for me now? Because this is going to be a certain level of trauma. I have a few torn muscles here and some things that are going to happen. I have to be conscious that what worked for me in the past could work now, or it may not work now. And that's what keeps me going, is that continuous self-observation, self-questioning to try to keep me in some level of healthy awareness.
Talk to us about leadership. You've been giving a lot of leadership lessons to companies out there that are growing. What are some tips for the folks that are listening here that run businesses or work for a company and want to move their way up?
It's a little bit of an expansion of what I just said about self-observation. I've talked to a few business owners here in the area, and they ask me, how do I work with so-and-so when they behave in this particular way? And that so-and-so can be a peer, it can be somebody who's they report into, or somebody that reports into them. The thing that I always say is, look, you are fully and 100% accountable for how you say things, but you're not responsible at all for how someone else perceives them. That's all happening in the model of the world that they've constructed in their brain as a function of where they were born and how they were raised and how they choose to live their lives today. You have two choices. You can either conclude that you're a reactive being and you're like a buoy floating in the ocean, and you're at the mercy of all the waves, going back and forth, and wherever the waves take you, that's where you go. Or you can choose science and understand that the brain is not a reactive organ, instead it's a predictive organ, and that is predicting the present based on a known past. And if you want the future to be different, you have to use the principles of neuroplasticity to retrain yourself to predict differently in the future so that you don't make the same mistakes of the past. If somebody pushes your buttons, what are you going to do today so that you no longer have a button? We walk around with all these buttons, and then we get upset when people push them. It's like, well, you don't want people to push your buttons, then don't have any buttons. Right. Go through a self-exploration and self-scrutiny process to eliminate those buttons. Whether that's your boss, or that's somebody that works for you, or that's a peer, it makes no difference. You have to go through that process and take ownership that how you react to the world is your responsibility. My experience is that not everybody wants to hear that. It's kind of a difficult pill to swallow. And I'm sure you've seen that when you tell people, in your world, it's like, you got to get up and move.
By the way, there's a great saying, there's nothing you can't walk off in life.
Yeah, just walk it off. Just go for a walk.
Just go for a walk. In my case, 2 burpees, whatever, but
do some level of movement. Yeah.
How do people find you?
I have a podcast called 3 Thoughts On by Raphael Andrade in YouTube. And also my webpage, canarium.com. Canarium is a CONARIUM. That's my consulting company where I do some mentoring and some coaching, and where all my content is. I work really hard to stay factual and to stay scientific, to not provide opinions, because I think we have so many of them out there. So everything that I do, I try to do it in a way that I present it to the people. And if new science shows up that invalidates what I said, I'm happy to stand corrected and to continue to learn. So those are the 2 main things, the 2 main pages that I have, and you can find me there.